Thank you so much, Mr. President of the Parliament, ladies and gentlemen. My name is difficult to pronounce in English. When I lived in the United States and went to a Starbucks, I used to say my name is Bob. So the President of the Parliament quoted Cicero. Cicero also said that brevity is a great charm of eloquence, so I'm going to be brief. I've been asked by the organizers to speak about the reform experience of the Greek government in the last 5 years, and focused primarily in the two portfolios that I was responsible for, namely digital transformation for the first 4 years of the cabinet of Kyriakos Pierrakakis, and then education. And I think it's quite pertinent to focus in both of these portfolios because of the fact that they both share what one would describe in Latin as memoria futuri, meaning a memory of the future. The fact that designing policies that address the future, as suggested before, even though it's extremely difficult to make accurate predictions, is extremely pertinent to the progress of nations. Having said this, the discussion on digital transformation, which was the first topic that we were responsible for and in effect constituted the success story of our government in the last years, stemmed from an OECD study. There was a study conducted by the OECD before the Greek crisis, which focused a lot on administrative burdens. And there we put a number. The number was 6.8% of our GDP, vis-à-vis the cost of administrative burdens to our economy, that being the highest of any member state of the OECD. And this was prior to the manifestation of the Greek crisis, which started in 2010 and required 3 IMF bailout packages for us to be able to stay afloat and then restart our economy. We always understood that we were one of the most bureaucratic nations of the OECD, perhaps the most bureaucratic nation of the OECD, and we had to define a story, we had to define a policy recipe to resolve the elements of this problem, which in our view were easy to resolve. The problems, as the President suggested, rather than the challenges. And the problem there was that we had a multitude of processes, and that our government and the design of our government was never, in fact, really centrally designed. It was a byproduct of independent designs by various organizations and ministries, rather than having a centralized version of what we wanted to achieve, having a centralized, let's say, thinking mechanism of how to produce change vis-à-vis how citizens are served or corporations are served by our government. Now, to give you a sense of what we tried to achieve and how we reversed engineered it, without having a very relevant case study on this, we tried to think oppositely. Typically, governments and states haven't been designed, as I suggested before, from the lens of the citizen. They are designed by the lens of the policymaker. This means that in a life event, starting from the birth of a child, ending to the passing of a loved one, each one of those events entails interactions with your government, interactions with your state. The measure of how bureaucratic your country is how many steps each one of those events entails. So in 2019, when we started our work, the birth of a child in Greece, to declare the original, let's say, the original declaration, the original citizen status of a child in Greece entailed 5 steps on behalf of the parents of the child. An original declaration at the hospital, you go to the municipality to declare the child's name, the pension fund of one of the parents, etc., etc. Now this is a single-step event because we changed the policy both in the books of law and in the screens of code by interoperating the systems and the data flows. So more or less this showcases the policy that we tried to achieve. In the passing of a loved one, the steps were 13, which made us say the obvious, that it's easier to be born in Greece rather than die in Greece. But having said this, no country has measured itself. This is what we found out in the process. Measuring itself, by measuring itself, I mean the following. The core policy that we wanted to achieve through this mechanism, which I described, was to have a single point of contact between the citizens and the government. This was actually the core digital reform, gov.gr. You can log on to gov.gr using your mobile phones right now, and you will see, it will be Greek to you, but you will see that it has a number of services which we offer digitally, and the services are about 1,700. We started by having 503 services on day one. It took us 9 months to measure how many services were already offered by the various ministries. Some services were offered by the Ministry of Finance, some from the Tax Office, some from the Ministry of Education, some from the Ministry of Labour, etc., etc. How many? We didn't know. It took us 9 months to find out. So step A was to have a central source of truth, a central portal. Step B was to start mapping and adding on top of it. And now, 4 years later, the services are 1,700, and the question emerges, 1,700 out of how many? No government in the world has an answer to this question right now. We have attempted to be the first, and we have another policy in place, which is trying to measure not the steps, but the events, the external services that we offer to citizens. It's called Mythos. It's a policy of this government. And there we found that those services were a bit north of 5,000. So effectively, the external events were around 5,500. And we have managed to digitize and simplify 1,700 out of those events, out of these processes. So this was one part, and actually one of the most popular reforms that we did in the previous years. And being able to change all of those things required us to create a new organization. And this organization is called the Ministry of Digital Governance. It's a new entity, which it took us some months to design before the elections of 2019. But it was required in order to be able to achieve change at speed and at scale, to endow this organization with specific legal and technological powers to be able to achieve this policy result. The most critical of those policies was the capability to interoperate any dataset of the state with any other dataset, thus being able to redesign those events that I described before. The second one was to have a central policy on the cloud, and the third one was to have centralized procurement. All of those three things taken together effectively created a centralized organization. Now, when we wanted to achieve this, and I think that this is very pertinent to any discussion with an organization like the OECD, we consulted with many, but we needed to find our own pathway. So we were studying what other countries had done. We studied Estonia, we studied Finland. We studied countries like Australia and New Zealand. Argentina had a very interesting digital service. The UK had a very interesting digital service. And in specific periods, rather than in continuum, those digital services managed to achieve significant results. The problem there was that we couldn't find a centralized toolkit of policies from which we could get advice. And I think that this is something that we direly need, because no country will have the same policy approach and the same map, but we all need the same compass. We all need to understand what we should be achieving in that policy. And the core element of this discussion is the fact that it's never about the technology. It's always about the service, and it's about centralized service design for citizens. And by that, let me mean the following, a very interesting case study on this. Vaccination. So Greece managed to produce one of the most interesting systems on vaccination for COVID-19 in 8 weeks. The reason the system was extremely successful is because of the fact that it matched capabilities from the Greek army vis-à-vis logistics, from the Greek Ministry of Health vis-à-vis vaccinating citizens, from the Ministry of Digital Governance with regards to the design of the service, and it was citizen-centric. The idea started from the fact that you needed predictability, you needed multiple channels of booking your appointment, you needed to know when you would be vaccinated on the basis of your condition and on your age. And we managed to achieve this predictability with a very smooth service and zero waiting times in many centers in Greece. Now, had we told this to Greek citizens a couple of years back, no one would have agreed that this would have been feasible. It was feasible because of the fact that it had a very strong managerial philosophy within it, that you needed to focus on the design, and that you needed to understand that strategy here is actually the delivery itself. If there's a core lesson, to cut a long story short, the core lesson for us is the fact that when you typically design such policies, philosophically and historically, we only have lawyers in the room and economists in the room. And I'm speaking to a room of economists. My thesis would be that we also need to have people who understand technology in the room. Not coders. I would call them public interest technologists. People who can ingrain the discussion on institutional design and financial and economic design with technical design, because you need all three in order to achieve a very strong service delivery. More or less, if I were to have a second lesson, metabolized from this experience is the fact that what you can't measure, you can't reform. And I think that this is at the core of the things that interest this room. Historically, when we started our crisis story in Greece and the 3 IMF bailout packages, we didn't have a number on many things that we wanted to touch and reform, one of them being the number of people who are hired by the Greek state as public servants. We managed to find those numbers with the help of organizations like the OECD as well, the European Union, the IMF, etc. But still, the RRF right now is going to be one of the most critical, I would say, ingredients to our reform story, because it's actually covering the full gap of our digital ambitions, of our state reform ambitions, because we will manage to be able to measure all the activities of our government. Because I mentioned vaccination before, and one of the things that we wanted to achieve was prioritizing people with conditions. Had we not have one of the most comprehensive e-prescription systems in Europe, to be able to reverse engineer ICD-10 conditions for people to be prioritized for the vaccine, we wouldn't have been able to achieve this prioritization properly. We would have only focused on age, and it would have only been a paper-based system, like in other places. So, what you can't measure, you can't reform. Digital is very interesting to achieve any type of such result, but moving forward and thinking of predictions, as previously suggested, I think that we will have, and moving to education, 2 core forces that will define the coming years. The first one is going to be technology and technological change. By that, I primarily mean Schumpeter, creative destruction, one technology displacing the other, and the typical technological change of the past, from horses to cars took some decades. Technological changes of today are going to take months or years. So those transitions and those shocks are going to be extremely quick. And the second one is demographics. There is a very interesting book called The 100-Year Life, which suggests that life expectancy, with the parenthesis of COVID, is going to be increasing by 1 year every 4 years in the coming years, thus rendering the average life expectancy of any child being born in an OECD member state to be more than 100 with more than 50% odds right now. So if you add demographics and technological change, this effectively means for education and for every policy area that the 3-phase life is over: education, work, pension. You will have more than 1 career, and this will basically disrupt our policy areas. It will disrupt labor, it will disrupt education, because the traditional focus of the previous generation was on a single bachelor's degree. The traditional focus of my generation when we were at school was a master's degree. And the current focus is going to be on some basic core skills at the beginning, and then continuous skills enrichment throughout your career and throughout your life, because you will fundamentally have more than 1 career. Those guiding principles are the core principles that are effectively enabling our policy and reform agenda. And effectively, as in every other country in the OECD, but I would say more acutely here because of the challenges that we have faced in the past, we have a dual role. On the one hand, we are resolving outstanding issues of yesterday, and on the other hand, we need to address emerging issues of today and tomorrow. And we have this dual philosophy of problems that we need to address, because what I described previously vis-à-vis digital is not a 4th industrial revolution problem, it's a 3rd industrial revolution problem. How do you integrate technology in your policy-making apparatus? But at the moment, we also have AI disrupting everything. So how do you do both? You do both because at the end of the day, some elements of the policy are common. Data interoperability, for instance, in digital. Or reforms like enabling the foundation of private universities in the Greek educational system, on which we were an outlier if you compare us to any other OECD member state. But we had actually a prohibition vis-à-vis the foundation of private universities in Greece since the 50s. And we haven't had it since the month of March, which just passed. So overall, we're trying to do both things at once, slay both dragons at once. And on the one hand, by resolving those outstanding issues like evaluating teachers or reverse engineering the PISA results of the OECD, vis-à-vis teacher evaluation, vis-à-vis curricular deployment, and on the other hand, deploying technologies in the classroom, this dual philosophy in every policy area, I think, is the core philosophy of this government, of Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis, and strongly explains why we have managed to achieve significant growth rates in the last years. The Minister of Finance, Mr. Hatzidakis, will explain the core elements of economic policy. I mostly wanted to focus in brevity on the core philosophical elements of all the other policy areas and how we have managed to achieve reforms at the speed that we have managed to achieve them. Once more, I wish that you will have a fruitful experience in Athens. Thank you very much for your attention.